Welcome to Terrified Tales, where things are about to get unsettling. Before we dive deeper into the darkness, make sure to like and subscribe. Let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. Are you brave enough to be here at night? Now, relax and let the fear take hold. Story 1. The sun sank behind the jagged peaks of Idaho's backcountry, leaving Elias Winters in the dying light of dusk. He was alone, miles from the nearest trail, surrounded by nothing but the wilderness, the kind of place where even the air felt unfamiliar, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Elias had been in remote areas before, studying wildlife, measuring ecosystems, but something about this place gnawed at him. The trees were thicker here, their trunks twisting up into the sky like gnarled fingers. The wind didn't whistle through the branches. It groaned low and mournful, like it was trying to communicate something just out of reach. The night was coming too quickly, and the temperature was already dropping. His camp was set up quickly, a tent, a small fire, and his equipment neatly arranged. But as he worked, a growing sense of unease took root. Every snap of a twig behind him sent his head snapping around, though he knew there was no one for miles. The forest, quiet as it was, had an oppressive weight to it. Elias shook the sensation off. He wasn't one to indulge in nerves, least of all in the presence of nature. Still, the thickening gloom pressed on him, and he could almost feel the trees closing in. He began unpacking his microphones, setting them up with clinical precision, determined to capture the ambient sounds of the wild. He wanted the raw, untouched noise, the kind of environmental data that would make his research stand out. A chill stirred in the air, like a whisper brushing the back of his neck. But when Elias turned, no one was there. He forced himself to focus, working well past dusk. With his gear in place, he sat on a log, pulled out his recorder, and pushed the button. The rustling of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the distant howl of a wolf. Just the sounds of the wild. But then, a slight distortion rippled through the air. Elias paused. The wind. No, something was different. He leaned closer to the headphones, adjusting the volume, straining to hear above the hum of the forest. And then, clearer than the rustling of the trees, a voice. Elias. The whisper was low, barely a breath, and for a moment Elias thought he had imagined it. A gust of wind, maybe. But the hairs on his neck stood up, the goosebumps on his arms, prickling. The voice was unmistakable, and it had said his name. His name. He pulled off the headphones, heart hammering in his chest. The night had grown darker. The fire flickered weakly, as if it too felt the weight of the silence around him. The trees loomed, shadows reaching toward him like dark claws. Had someone else been out there? He shook the thought away, trying to tell himself it was just a trick of the mind. After all, this was Idaho, one of the least populated places in the country. There was no one out here, no one for miles. But that voice. Elias glanced toward the tent, his pulse quickening. There was nothing, just the wind. He forced a nervous laugh, but it didn't sound quite right in his ears. Just the wind, he muttered under his breath. He was being ridiculous. He had to be. But as he sat there, staring into the forest, a thought nagged at him. Who had whispered his name? The moment was brief, but the unease lingered, hanging heavy in the air like fog. His fingers tightened around the recorder, his thoughts swirling in the quiet, broken only by the unsettling sounds of the forest that had just grown a little darker, a little deeper. Something in the distance. Was it movement? A shadow shifting. Between the trees, Elias. The voice came again, but this time, it was much closer. The fire crackled weakly in the growing dark, casting long, twitching shadows across the camp. Elias sat, his hands trembling ever so slightly, though he would have never admitted it. He forced himself to focus on the task at hand. The wind had picked up again, groaning through the pines like a hollowed-out, aged creature. Each gust felt deliberate, as if the forest were exhaling in slow, measured breaths. Elias wasn't one for superstition, but even a seasoned researcher like him couldn't ignore the fact that something about tonight felt wrong. He glanced over at his recording equipment, still untouched and perfectly arranged. It seemed almost too still now, as though the devices were waiting for something. Perhaps it was his nerves playing tricks on him. But the closer he looked, the more every tiny detail seemed to shift, as if the forest were watching him, studying his every move. Focus, he reminded himself. Pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders, Elias went to work, setting up additional microphones and adjusting the placement of the one already running. He wanted to capture every subtle sound, from the smallest rustle of a rodent in the underbrush to the deeper calls of a distant predator. The recording gear was state-of-the-art, built to withstand the harshest conditions. But something about the hum of the microphone, the faint, crackling static from his headphones, felt too loud now. Elias adjusted the volume, annoyed at his own sensitivity. Suddenly, a particularly strong gust of wind rattled the branches above, and the shadows in the forest shifted unnervingly. Elias flinched, but pushed through the unease. He had a job to do. He toggled a few switches on the recording device, and then stood back to listen. The forest symphony resumed, the whisper of wind through the branches, the rustling of leaves, the occasional chirp of insects. Elias sighed in relief. Nothing unusual, and yet the forest itself felt empty, as though the animals had vacated the area, as though something had chased them away. The silence between the noises seemed unnatural. The woods should have been teeming with life, but instead they felt hollow, as if every living creature in the vicinity had gone into hiding. A shiver crawled down Elias's spine, and he rubbed the back of his neck, forcing himself to look away from the darkening trees. There was no reason for concern. It was just the time of year, temperatures dropping, animals preparing for the long winter. But still, the hair on the back of his neck refused to lie flat. Elias adjusted his position, making his way over to the second set of microphones, which he'd placed further into the forest. The trees here were densely packed, their trunks twisting unnaturally toward the heavens, their branches tangled as if trying to hold secrets within the canopy. The air was thicker, carrying with it a sharp, pungent scent of pine and earth. But beneath it, there was something else, a faint, musty odor that felt wrong, as if something decayed were hiding just beyond the reach of his eyes. He tried to shake off the unease, convinced it was nothing more than the oppressive atmosphere of the place, but his instincts were beginning to hum with an unsettling energy. The equipment was flawless. The readings were clear. The microphones were registering every wind gust, every whisper of movement in the forest. Elias could hear each individual leaf quivering, the birds, the insects, everything. But he froze, one hand still hovering over the microphone, the other gripping the recorder. There it was again. That low, almost imperceptible distortion, the brief crackling. But this time, there was something else. A faint sound beneath the static. A whisper. Elias. His heart slammed against his ribcage. He jerked backward, his breath catching in his throat. The voice was unmistakable, his name. But Elias had double-checked the area before setting up. There was no one out here. His camp was still intact. No signs of movement, no disturbances. Impossible. He pressed the button to rewind the recording, his hands now shaking slightly as he listened to the playback. His own voice, clear, methodical, calm, echoed in his ears. There were no gaps, no interruptions. Until that strange distortion. Elias rewound it again, the crackling growing louder in the silence. Then, there it was again. Elias, closer this time. The voice wasn't just in the recording anymore, it felt real, felt present. The wind outside had picked up, but this voice, this whisper, was unnervingly direct, cutting through the hum of static like a blade through velvet. Elias gritted his teeth and shut off the recorder, his mind racing. It must be interference, the dense forest, the equipment, the humidity. Surely that was all it was. Some trick of the sound, some malfunction of the gear. That's all. But then why? Why had it said his name? He turned back to face the darkening. Woods, the pines stretching like silent sentinels. Something was out there. Something he couldn't explain. And for the first time in his life, Elias felt like the woods themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. The darkness outside Elias's tent thickened, settling into the forest like a heavy, suffocating fog. Even though the night sky was clear, the moon barely pierced through the canopy, as if the trees themselves were intent on hiding the light from him. Elias sat huddled in the corner of his tent, watching the fire outside flicker sporadically. The warmth of the campfire failed to reach him where he sat, trapped by a chill that had crept into his bones and refused to leave. The low murmur of the forest was still there, the rustling of the leaves, the occasional chirp of a night bird. But something was off. Something was missing. The air felt still, too still, and as he sat listening, Elias realized with a strange unease that he could no longer hear the soft hum of distant animal activity. It was as though the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. He reached over to his recorder, running a hand through his hair. The evening had not gone as planned. The soundscape was far too quiet, the wind barely moving the branches above. Even with all his expertise in capturing wildlife, Elias felt the weight of the silence more than he could explain. His instincts buzzed in his head, but he tried to ignore them. He focused instead on the screen of his recorder, watching the lines of data spike and settle in predictable rhythms. But even as he looked at it, he felt something creeping in, the weight of being watched. The thought was absurd. He was miles from the nearest person. There was nothing but miles of wilderness surrounding him, but that didn't stop his skin from prickling. He had seen things in his career, strange behaviors from animals, curious and unexplained phenomena, but none of it had ever felt like this. This was something else. Then, as if to punctuate his thoughts, something shifted in the air. A sound. It started as a faint crackling, like a radio signal trying to find its frequency, lost somewhere in the static. Elias, still lost in his thoughts, thought it was just the wind again. But when the crackling became a steady pulse, and his eyes darted toward his recorder, his breath hitched in his throat. A voice. It was impossibly soft at first, barely a whisper. The kind of thing that could be dismissed as a figment of the mind, a trick of the wind or a passing animal. But no, this wasn't an animal sound. Elias could tell that much. It was too deliberate. It had an unmistakable rhythm to it, a cadence that felt familiar. His name. Elias. The voice was not a howl, nor a bark, nor anything that could be attributed to any creature living in these woods. It was a whisper, slow, purposeful, as though someone was speaking directly into his ear. Elias's heart pounded in his chest, and his first instinct was to shut off the recorder. But curiosity won out. He pressed the button to replay the tape, his eyes wide, his pulse thudding in his temples. There it was again. Elias. Louder this time, but still faint. It seemed to carry with it a weight, a sense of urgency he couldn't explain. Elias's hand hovered over the equipment, unsure whether he should shut it off and call it a night or keep listening, even though the pit in his stomach had turned into a gnawing ache of dread. What was it? The whisper seemed so real. It felt like it was coming from just beyond the fabric of the tent, as if something unseen was standing right there, breathing the air that he breathed. He pulled the headphones off quickly, his skin prickling with the cold sweat that had appeared on the back of his neck. He turned his head, eyes flickering from one corner of the tent to the other, scanning for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The tent remained still, the wind outside still, no more than a gentle sigh in the trees. No sign of anyone. Still, the whisper lingered in his mind, echoing in the hollow spaces of his thoughts. He closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to take slow, deliberate breaths. "It's nothing," he told himself. "Just the wind playing tricks on your mind." Elias opened his eyes, standing up and stepping to the tent door, suddenly feeling like a caged animal. His legs moved mechanically, each step bringing him closer to the door flap. It was as though some invisible force was drawing him, urging him to look outside. He fumbled with the zipper for a moment, the metallic sound too loud in the quiet night. He paused, then yanked it open. The night air hit him like a slap. Cold. Too cold. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something in the atmosphere. The forest beyond his camp, a vast sea of pine and shadow, felt almost unnatural in the way it stood there, silent and unmoving, as though it had forgotten how to breathe. The crackling of the fire was all he could hear now, too loud, too harsh. The light from the flames painted the trunks of the trees in harsh orange, but beyond the firelight, the woods were an impenetrable black. Elias squinted into the darkness. He could hear nothing. No birds, no rustling of small animals, only the whisper of wind through the pines. But that wasn't enough to comfort him. Something was wrong. He could feel it now, deep in his bones. This place was empty. There was no life, no movement. He stepped outside the tent, careful to keep his flashlight aimed low, not wanting to break the fragile silence. The beam cut through the darkness, dancing across the underbrush and rocks. Nothing. He swallowed, his throat dry. The air felt wrong, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. It's just nerves, he thought. Again. But the whisper, Elias, still echoed in his mind. It sounded so clear, so close. The wind picked up again, rustling the branches above him, but Elias didn't flinch. He was too distracted by the noise. The crackling of the wind was so strong that for a moment he thought it was mocking him, almost as if it had heard him. Then, there it was again. A sharp, deliberate whisper, just barely cutting through the wind, just barely above the hum of the trees. Elias, louder, closer. Elias's heart skipped a beat, his breath caught in his throat. He spun around, his flashlight sweeping across, the empty space, desperately searching for the source. There was nothing, and yet he felt it, the sensation of being watched. The presence that was not quite there, but just out of sight. A low thud sounded in the distance, somewhere behind him in the blackness. It was followed by another, and then another, like something, or someone, was walking just beyond his range of vision. Elias froze. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Elias, come closer." The air seemed to tighten, pressing in around him, and he felt a compulsion in his chest, a deep primal urge to follow the voice. Something in him screamed to turn away, but his body refused to listen. He took a slow step forward. His feet felt heavy, reluctant, like they were moving on their own accord. With every step, the voice became clearer, its edges more distinct, more insistent. It was not the wind. Elias's mind spun. He had been alone in these woods for days now, no other campers, no hikers. The wilderness was meant to be empty, so what was calling him? He took another step. The whisper was growing louder now, wrapping itself around his thoughts like a tightening rope. "Come closer, Elias. We are waiting." And then, just as abruptly as it had started, the whisper stopped. The night was deathly still. Elias stood, frozen, breath shallow, his eyes darting to every shadow around him. His pulse thundered in his ears. The silence felt wrong now, and that's when he heard it. Behind him, a faint rustling, the shuffle of feet, a breath, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving just out of sight. Elias whipped around, his heart now in his throat. Elias stood there, heart racing, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the dense, inky blackness that surrounded him. His mind scrambled, desperate to make sense of the eerie quiet, the unsettling stillness that now permeated the forest. He tried to focus on the sounds, the soft rustle of the trees swaying in the wind, the distant chirp of a night bird. But none of it felt real. The world felt wrong. Just an animal, he told himself. Just an animal. But the rustling, the distinct shuffle of something or someone was too deliberate, too close. Elias could feel the blood draining from his face, his breath quickening as his eyes darted from one shadow to another, desperately trying to find a shape, a figure, something that could explain the sound. But the forest was just shadows and whispers. He took another step, and then another, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. The flashlight flickered, as if it, too, sensed the disturbance in the air, and Elias quickly tapped it against his palm, urging the light back into steady brilliance. Another rustle. Too close. He spun toward the noise, but nothing was there. The darkness yawned at him, oppressive and thick, as if the night itself were a living thing, swallowing up any trace of movement, any trace of life. Elias felt like he was trapped in some twisted version of reality, one where the laws of nature didn't apply. The wind seemed to swirl around him, pulling at his jacket, tugging at his skin, as if it were alive, playing a game with him. His flashlight was the only thing keeping the void at bay, and the light quivered with every breath the wind took. Then, from just beyond the beam's reach, a voice, a whisper, the same low, hollow sound that had invaded his thoughts earlier. Elias, you're so close now. It was closer this time. So close that Elias could feel the warmth of its breath, could almost smell it. A dank, musky scent that reminded him of rot. His stomach lurched and he staggered back a step as though he could escape it by moving away. But there was nowhere to run. The trees surrounded him, tall and unmoving, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching down, grabbing at him, closing in. Elias took a few deep breaths, forcing his body to calm, his mind to focus. It's not real. It's just the wilderness. The isolation playing tricks on you. It's the wind, the acoustics of the forest. But his rational mind couldn't deny the gnawing fear in his chest. Something was wrong. He felt it now, not just in his head, but in his bones. The forest wasn't just empty. It was waiting. It was waiting for something to happen. He spun around again, eyes scanning, but the only thing he saw was the endless, oppressive darkness. The shadows felt too thick, too alive. And in the distance, he thought he saw something. Just a flicker of movement, a shape darting between the trees. Without thinking, Elias began to move toward it. His steps were slow at first, hesitant, but the instinct to follow, to uncover what was hidden in the shadows, grew stronger with every second. His feet seemed to move on their own, and before he knew it, he was walking deeper into the woods, the trees closing in on either side. The whisper came again. Elias, come closer. This time, it was unmistakable. There was no mistaking the voice. It was deep, raspy, but somehow filled with a sinister sweetness. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the trees. It was something else. Something otherworldly. He stopped abruptly, his heart hammering in his chest. His breath came in ragged bursts. The forest felt alive now, the very air thick with anticipation. The shadows stretched out before him like fingers, grasping at him, pulling him in. Elias turned back. The camp was a distant memory now, too far behind, too unreachable. The trail that had led him into these woods was gone, swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. He had no idea where he was anymore. The trees were different here, older, twisted in unnatural shapes. They loomed like silent sentinels, their branches hanging low, their bark slick with something damp and unnatural. The ground beneath him was soft, spongy, like it was absorbing every footstep, as though it didn't want him to leave. He had to get back. He had to. But before he could turn around, a figure emerged from the darkness. A man, or what looked like a man. He was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally, too long, too thin. His face was obscured by shadows, his features impossible to make out. But Elias felt the presence of something ancient and hungry radiating from him. The figure didn't move, not at first. It simply stood there, its form flickering between the trees like a mirage. The wind stopped. The forest held its breath. Even the whispers fell silent, as though the world itself was afraid to speak. Elias froze. The figure's eyes, if they could be called eyes, flared open, two dark pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. For a moment, Elias thought they were simply black voids, nothing but emptiness. But as he stared, he realized they were full of something else, a darkness that pulsed with energy, as though the very essence of the forest itself was trapped inside them. The thing, tilted its head, its long neck bending at an unnatural angle. The air seemed to crackle around it, charged with an eerie energy, and for a brief moment, Elias was certain he could hear it laughing, though there were no sounds. Just a feeling, like the space between the trees was vibrating with some unspoken joke. And then, in a voice that seemed to echo from deep within the earth, it spoke. "You've come too far, Elias." The words slid into his mind like a cold knife, chilling him to the bone. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His breath caught in his throat, trapped in the cold grip of fear. The figure stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. Each movement was fluid, unnatural, like the thing was no longer bound by the rules of reality. The shadows seemed to cling to it, as though it was part of the night itself, pulling its shape from the depths of the darkness. Elias could feel the weight of its presence, its hunger, as it drew closer, its long fingers reaching toward him, like they could stretch across the very air. He staggered back, his feet stumbling over the uneven forest floor. His heart raced in his chest, but he couldn't move. His body was frozen in place like he was rooted to the ground. The air around him felt heavy, thick with something foul, something ancient. The scent of decay, of death, of something long forgotten. "You've awakened it," the figure whispered. Elias's chest constricted. He gasped for breath, the world spinning around him. The forest, the trees, the shadows. They were closing in. The figure was getting closer, and with every step it took, the ground beneath Elias's feet seemed to sink a little deeper, as if the very earth was pulling him in, eager to claim him. His pulse thundered in his ears, and suddenly everything seemed too loud. The sound of his own breath, ragged and shallow, filled the silence. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. It's too late now. And then, the figure's mouth opened. Not a human mouth, no. This was something else. The black voids in its face twisted, pulled apart, revealing a gaping maw filled with rows of jagged teeth that seemed to stretch into infinity. Elias screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness. Elias's scream caught in his throat, strangled by the suffocating darkness. The mouth of the thing, if it could be called a mouth, yawned wide, impossibly wide, as though it had been waiting for that exact moment. The jagged teeth stretched into a void that seemed to go on forever, pulling the very light from the air. The trees, the night, the forest, everything around him began to distort, as if reality itself were bending, warping, under the pressure of the thing's presence. He tried to move, to break free, but his limbs wouldn't obey him. It was like the earth had become liquid, sucking him in, pulling at his very soul. The air around him thickened, became viscous, clinging to his skin like tar. His breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't seem to draw in enough oxygen. The weight of the atmosphere was pressing down on him, suffocating him, as if the very fabric of the world was folding in around him, shrinking the space he had left to exist. The thing's eyes, those impossible, bottomless pits, were locked on him, but Elias couldn't tear his gaze away. There was no escape. It was as if the darkness within those eyes was pulling him in inch by inch, slowly, inexorably. His mind screamed at him to look away, to run, to do anything. But it was too late. The blackness from those eyes was now inside him, settling into the deepest corners of his thoughts, flickering behind his eyelids. And then, in the deafening silence that followed, it spoke again. "You should never have come here, Elias." The voice was no longer the faint whisper from before. Now, it was an insidious hum, like the resonance of the earth's bones, vibrating through his chest, shaking his very core. It felt as though it was reaching inside him, pulling at something, deep inside, something he hadn't even known was there. He shook his head, as though trying to wake up from a terrible dream. But this was no dream. He could feel it deep in his gut, the coldness creeping up his spine, the sense of something ancient, something forgotten, that had been buried here in these woods for far too long. The figure took a step closer, its limbs unnaturally long, as though they didn't belong to a human body. Each movement was fluid, eerily graceful, like it had no need for bones, no need for muscles. It was part of the forest itself, an extension of the trees, the shadows, the night. The thing was the forest, and the forest was it. Elias's head spun. He couldn't think. He couldn't process what he was seeing, what was happening. His mouth opened, but the words were lost, choked by the air in his lungs. His mind felt like it was unraveling, coming undone in a way he couldn't explain. And all the while the thing's eyes, those impossible black pits, burned into him, pulling his thoughts into a void, one he could not escape. He staggered backward, his boots sliding on the damp forest floor, and for a split second, he thought he might actually make it. The thing was still moving slowly, deliberately toward him, its grin widening like a rift in the universe itself, but the dread was too heavy, too overwhelming. It had already consumed him, already seeped into his mind, and now there was no way out. And then, as he took one final step back, the ground beneath him gave way. Elias cried out as his foot sank deeper into the forest floor. He tried to scramble to pull himself free, but his foot was trapped, caught in the dark, wet earth. The pressure of the thing's presence pressed down on him even harder, suffocating him, as though the world itself had turned against him, and there was nothing left but the unrelenting force of the darkness closing in. It was here. It's too late. The words whispered through his mind like a prophecy. His stomach twisted with dread, and in that instant, the sensation of something crawling, slithering across his skin, beneath his clothes, gripped him. He gasped, his breath coming in erratic bursts, but the feeling only intensified. The thing was moving, its presence wrapping around him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. The figure loomed over him now, its towering form blotting out what little light remained in the forest. Elias's pulse thundered in his, ears as the creature's grin grew impossibly wider, stretching from ear to ear, its jagged teeth gleaming in the faint glow of his dying flashlight. The void that had once been its mouth seemed to expand, as though it could consume him whole. And then, just when Elias thought he would lose himself entirely to the darkness, the figure spoke again, its voice like 1,000 whispers, all blending together into a single guttural sound. "You've awakened me." The ground beneath Elias shifted, the earth splitting open, pulling him downward as though it was eager to swallow him whole. He cried out, his fingers clawing at the soil, but the more he struggled, the more the earth seemed to tighten around him, refusing to let him escape. This is it. The thought burned in his mind like a cold fire. There was no way out. The thing had him, and it wasn't going to let him go. It had been waiting for someone like him, someone who could stumble into this forgotten corner of the world and awaken it. And now, there was nothing left but the slow, inevitable descent into the black abyss. Elias's body went limp as the ground swallowed him deeper, his heart pounding in his chest. His breath came in gasps, the cold air rushing past him as the earth continued to pull him down, further into the darkness. But as he fell, a sudden, sharp pain tore through his chest. His breath hitched, his vision blurring as the ground twisted. Beneath him, his body felt like it was being torn in two, ripped apart from the inside. Something was inside him now. He could feel it, moving, writhing in his skin, and then, as everything seemed to dissolve into blackness, he heard it, the whisper. But it wasn't from the creature. This whisper was familiar, soft. Elias. The voice that had once called to him in the quiet of the night. The voice that had welcomed him to this place. Elias, come back. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. Elias's body hung in the abyss, suspended between the oppressive blackness of the earth and the suffocating air around him. Time felt strange here, slow yet suffocatingly fast, as though every heartbeat was the last he would ever feel. His chest ached, and he couldn't decide if the pain was real or just part of the nightmare consuming him. He wanted to scream, but his throat was dry, cracked, as if he hadn't spoken in days or perhaps centuries. The voice, his name, lingered in the air around him, whispering, beckoning. Elias, come back. It was his name, but not in the way. He remembered it. The words felt like a force pulling him, dragging him through the heavy blackness. He could hear the rustle of leaves, the crack of twigs breaking underfoot. Was someone coming for him? No. The air was thick with the same foul, rotten stench, the scent of decay, of death. His body jerked involuntarily, as though his instincts recognized the truth before his mind could. He wasn't alone. He was being watched. He twisted his head, struggling to free his body from the invisible chains that held him. His skin felt tight, his muscles taut with the effort to move. But it was as if something far greater than him, something ancient and powerful, held him still, shackled in place. He fought, desperate for release, but every time he tried, the pressure on his chest only grew heavier, suffocating him from the inside out, and then, like a wave crashing over him, the pain hit again. It came from deep within, a pulsing ache that started in his chest and radiated outward, spreading through his limbs, his bones, his very soul. It was as if something was growing, something inside him, tearing at the fabric of who he was, stretching him thinner, thinner, until he was no longer Elias, the wildlife researcher, the man with a name, but a vessel for something far darker, something ancient, something with roots deeper than the earth itself. A scream tore from his throat, but it was cut short by the earth itself, which seemed to absorb it. damp and cold, swallowing the sound as though it had never existed. His mind spiraled. Was he going mad? Had he already lost his grip on reality, lost his sense of self to the thing beneath the surface? The voice, familiar yet distant, came again, and this time Elias understood. It wasn't the thing, it wasn't the entity that had taken form in front of him. It was him. It was the forest. Come back. You've always belonged to us. The words echoed in his mind, twisting and distorting like the wind howling through an open window. A part of him fought the truth, the darkness gnawing at the edge of his thoughts. But another part, something older, something primal, seemed to pull him closer to the idea. The forest had always been here, waiting. It had always been a part of him, buried beneath layers of reason and science. The research, the wildlife, the maps, it had all been a cover, a distraction. This place was always waiting for him, always drawing him closer, and now it was calling him home. And with that understanding came the crushing weight of revelation. The forest was not just a place. It was alive. It was a living thing that had been here before him, and it would be here long after. It had no name, no clear form, but it was ancient, its roots winding deep into the earth, intertwined with every tree, every stone, every creature that had ever walked, crawled, or flown. Beneath the canopy, it was not some dark god or entity from folklore. No, this forest, this cursed place, was the god. The forest was its own force, and Elias, in all his curiosity and arrogance, had stumbled upon it. The sharp pain in his chest flared again, but this time it didn't feel like something tearing him apart. No, it felt like something awakening. Elias gasped, his lungs filling with air that tasted of rot and wet earth, his vision blurring as the darkness swirled around him like thick fog. His heart hammered. The pain now felt natural, like a missing piece of himself had been found and was being reconnected, restored. A part of him was awakening to something that had always been there, buried in the deepest corners of his mind, his being, and then he felt it. Something inside him, something alive, began to crawl through his veins, threading through his blood. It was like fire and ice at once, suffusing him with a knowledge he didn't want, didn't understand. The forest had claimed him just as it had claimed so many before, and now he was a part of it. But more than that, he had become it. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the forest around him answered. The trees groaned, the wind howled, and the ground trembled as, though a mighty force was stirring beneath, the whispering voices of the ancient pines, voices of the dead, of those who had wandered too deep into this cursed wilderness, began to rise in unison. Welcome home, Elias. And in that moment, the earth split wide open beneath him. The air shifted again, and Elias was falling into the center of the darkness, deeper than before, farther than any human being had ever gone. The force of the fall was unlike anything he'd experienced. His body tumbled through space, like a rag doll being tossed about by some unseen hand. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. He felt weightless, as though he had passed, beyond the veil that separated the living from the dead. And then he landed. Hard. The ground beneath him was slick and wet, the sound of his body hitting it a sickening thud that echoed in his ears. His limbs were heavy, aching, but he no longer felt the pain, not in the way he used to. The new sensation was something else entirely, something both familiar and alien, like waking from a dream and realizing that the dream had always been real. Elias opened his eyes, blinking against the dark. The world around him was different. The shadows seemed deeper, the colors darker, as though the world had shifted in a way that couldn't be explained. But then again, Elias didn't need an explanation. He understood. The forest had given him the understanding, the knowledge, the truth. He wasn't alone anymore. No, Elias was a part of something greater now, something that pulsed beneath the roots of the trees, in the very soil beneath his feet. It was in his blood, in his veins, spreading through him like wildfire, a fever that would never die. As he stood up, the weight of the darkness clung to him. His fingers twitched as if they were made of something different, something other. The air was thick with energy, with the pulse of the forest. And then he heard it again, the voice. "We have always been here, Elias." And this time, he didn't resist. The air around Elias was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sharp tang of decay. His heart thudded in his chest, but it wasn't the same heartbeat anymore. No, this was deeper, slower, more primal, as if his body had been attuned to a different rhythm altogether, one that hummed in harmony with the earth beneath his feet, the forest. It had him now. The realization bloomed in him like a dark flower. The trees swayed above, their branches whispering in a language too ancient for his human mind to fully grasp. The whispers were no longer just sounds, they were thoughts, and they crawled into his mind like 1,000 tiny, insidious insects. Elias could feel them gnawing at him, digging into the places where his old identity, his old self, used to hide. But it wasn't just the whispers, it was the pull toward the heart of the forest, toward something deeper, a place where the roots of the trees tangled like veins in the earth, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead no longer existed. The ground beneath his feet felt alive, breathing with him, like an extension of his own body. Every step he took was accompanied by the faint sensation of something brushing against his skin, the edges of his consciousness constantly fraying. Elias turned his head, his eyes darting through the shadows. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was a remnant of the man he had been, but he still searched for an escape. Somewhere, deep in the recesses of his mind, a voice that had once been his own still whispered, pleading for him to fight. But the darkness around him was too thick, too vast to escape. He couldn't even remember why he wanted to leave anymore. He belonged here now. As his feet shuffled forward, the forest seemed to open up before him. The trees, thick and twisted, parted just enough for him to pass through, guiding him along an invisible path. The earth seemed to rise up to meet him, offering its soft, wet embrace, pulling him toward an ancient altar. There, at the heart of the forest, was a clearing, a place that looked almost untouched by time. The air here felt wrong, heavy, suffused with a presence that was both foreign and familiar. The altar was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was not a stone structure like those in ancient ruins, nor a crumbled monument lost to time. No, this was alive, grown from the earth itself. Roots and vines twisted together to form a large circular platform, the edges lined with dark, mottled stone that looked more like the remnants of something once human. In the center, a pulsing red glow illuminated the scene, a light that seemed to breathe in and out, slow and rhythmic. Elias's feet moved of their own accord, the pull too strong to resist now. He stepped into the clearing, and immediately the whispers rose to a fever pitch, louder and louder, until the sound filled every corner of his mind. The ancient language was no longer a murmur. It was now a chorus, a symphony of voices from every direction. His thoughts fragmented, slipping between realities. A dark presence loomed over him, a shadow too vast to comprehend. It was not something visible, but something felt, like the weight of the world settling onto his shoulders, crushing him into submission. Yet there was no fear. Elias's body no longer responded to fear the way it once had. There was only acceptance. Then, a low, resonant voice, deep and endless, reverberated through the ground beneath him. "You are here." It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an acknowledgement. Elias opened his mouth to speak, but his voice failed him, swallowed up by the immensity of the presence. His hands clenched at his sides, his fingers digging into his palms until the skin split and blood trickled down his wrists. But it didn't hurt. Nothing hurt. The voice came again, clearer this time, and this time it wasn't just the forest that spoke. It was the forest inside him. A terrible, cold laugh echoed through the clearing as the voice echoed in his mind. "You have awakened the old pacts. Elias, the pact your ancestors made long before you were born." The truth was dawning on him, a revelation so profound that it shattered the fragments of his sanity. His blood ran cold, and yet he stood frozen, his body no longer his own. The forest had always been waiting for someone like him, waiting for the bloodline that had been marked, chosen, to walk through the veil, to become the conduit between the earth and the beyond. His name had always been written in the roots, etched into the soil of this land long before he was born. And now, he was here, standing at the altar of his fate. His ancestors had known this day would come. Elias's head swam with images, flashes, of memories that weren't his own. He saw figures in the trees, shadows moving in the corners of his mind, men and women, ancient and wise, standing beneath the full moon, chanting in that same forgotten language. They had made a pact, a promise to the forest, to the ancient being that had slumbered in its depths. They had pledged their bloodline, their souls to it. And now, Elias had come to fulfill that promise. The ground trembled beneath him as the altar pulsed again, its red glow growing brighter. From within the earth, roots began to rise, wrapping around his ankles, pulling him toward the center of the altar. The branches of the trees above him seemed to bend inward, their leaves rustling with the force of 1,000 whispers. The voices grew louder, as though they were coming from within him now, swirling around his mind, tearing apart the last vestiges of his humanity. The words were no longer in the language of man. They were something other, something too ancient for his mind to comprehend. But he understood. The pact had been made, the price had been paid, and now it was time for him to join. Elias felt the ground shift beneath him as his body was pulled deeper into the roots. His skin burned as the earth's energy flowed into him, filling his veins, crawling through his bones, binding him to the forest in a way that was both agonizing and euphoric. It was no longer a question of if he would join. It was how. His flesh began to shift, his bones creaking, elongating as the earth consumed him. And then there was silence. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And finally, the voice came once. "More! You are one of us now, Elias." And in that moment, Elias understood. His name was no longer Elias. He was no longer the man who had once walked the earth exploring the wilderness. He was something greater, something ancient, something entwined with the forest, with the roots, with the eternal darkness that whispered from the depths. He had become the forest itself. The red light from the altar flickered, then dimmed, and the whispers faded into a peaceful, eternal hum. The world around him had changed. The night was still. The trees towered above him like silent sentinels, watching, waiting, as the roots of the forest spread farther than he could see. And as Elias looked out across the endless expanse of trees, he felt a strange satisfaction. The pact had been fulfilled. The forest had claimed him. And in the silence of that dark, endless night, the ancient entity stirred within the earth, its slumber once again complete. Elias stood at the heart of the forest, or perhaps it stood at the heart of him. The boundary between his own mind and the world around him had blurred. He no longer knew where the forest ended and where he began. His body, his human form, was barely more than a distant memory, a whisper of something long past. He was one with the trees, one with the roots that dug deep into the earth, wrapping around the bones of the earth like ancient tendrils. The night was thick with a sense of time slipping away. Years, centuries, or perhaps just moments. It didn't matter. Time had become irrelevant in this place. Everything had become irrelevant. The forest was alive, not just alive in the way that the trees swayed in the wind or the leaves rustled underfoot, but alive in the deepest sense of the word. It breathed, it pulsed, it watched. Every leaf, every branch, every creature was a reflection of the larger consciousness that held this land in its dark embrace. Elias could feel it, could feel the silent gaze of the forest stretching into every corner of his mind, into the spaces he had never dared to venture. And then the whispers returned. You are the watcher now. It wasn't just the trees speaking to him, or the wind, or the creatures of the forest. No, this was something far older, far deeper than any of those. It was the voice of the land itself, the voice of the earth resonating in every particle of his being. The words slid into him like oil, slick and smooth, spreading through his veins, coloring his every thought. He was the watcher now, the watcher of the forest, the eternal guardian of this sacred, forsaken land. And as the voice spoke to him, as it filled him, Elias understood the truth. The pact that had been made so long ago wasn't just about the forest gaining a new servant. No, the pact had been about continuity, about maintaining the balance between the living and the dead, the seen and the unseen. The forest needed someone to watch over it, someone to guard its secrets, its mysteries. The forest needed a conduit, a being who could straddle the line between the natural world and the world beyond, someone who could keep the balance intact and protect its ancient power. And that someone was Elias. His soul, his essence, had been reborn into this role. His human life had been a passing thing, a fleeting moment in the grand, timeless cycle of the earth. But now he was part of something far greater than himself. He was the keeper of the forest's memory, the one who would guard its heart against any who would dare trespass. He was the one who would guide the lost, punish the foolish, and watch over the cursed land that had been his birthright all along. The watcher never sleeps. The voice coiled around him, entwining itself with the rhythm of his thoughts. And neither will you. The thought came to him. How long had he been standing here? How long had he been a part of this eternal cycle of watching and waiting? Had it been minutes, hours, days? It was impossible to say. The forest had no sense of time, no concept of days or years or seasons. It only knew what was necessary to maintain the balance. Elias's thoughts turned inward. He thought of the man he had been, the researcher who had come to the wilderness seeking knowledge, seeking answers. He thought of the research journals, the maps, the equipment, the entire life he had left behind. It all felt so small now, so irrelevant. What was the point of cataloguing creatures or observing ecosystems when the true nature of existence was so much darker, so much more profound? His gaze shifted upward to the canopy, the thick layers of leaves above, where the stars seemed dim and distant. There was no moon tonight. The forest was swallowed in a blanket of shadow, as if the very sky had become part of the darkness. But Elias wasn't afraid. He understood. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a living thing, a force that had existed before humanity had walked the earth and would continue long after they were gone. It was as old as the bones of the world, older than civilization, older than the very idea of time itself. And now Elias, was its guardian, its vessel. Suddenly, a sharp, jagged thought pierced his consciousness. A memory, a voice. He thought of the others, the researcher who had come before him, the man who had stood at the edge of the same clearing, gazing at the altar just as Elias had, feeling the same pull in his chest. The man who had sought to understand the dark power of the forest, the power that lurked beneath the surface, hidden from the world. The one who had come too close, the one who had seen too much, the one who had made the same fateful decision Elias had made, the one who had disappeared. And then Elias understood. The Watcher, it wasn't a position given to just anyone. It was a role that passed from one to another. The previous Watcher's soul was not consumed, not destroyed. No, the previous Watcher became part of the forest. Their essence was absorbed into the roots, into the soil, into the very air. And in return, a new soul was chosen. A new Watcher was born from the forest itself. The others had been chosen too. And just as quickly as the thought had come, Elias felt a sudden pressure in his chest. A coldness spread through his veins. He wasn't alone in his mind. Not anymore. The previous Watcher's presence filled him like a second skin, merging with him. It was the presence of the one who had come before, the one who had left behind. Whispers of their own in the wind, their voice, their thoughts, their very essence now mingled with his, filling his consciousness, expanding his understanding of what it meant to be the eternal Watcher. He wasn't Elias anymore, not in the way he had been. He was the forest. He was its heart, and he was its memory. The voice returned, stronger than before. You are the Watcher, Elias, now and forever. Your task is endless. You will guard the balance. You will protect the veil, and you will watch. It wasn't just the forest speaking now. It was the memory of all the Watchers before him. Their thoughts and experiences had merged with his, becoming one. They were him now, and he was them. He could feel their emotions, their desires, their regrets, their pains. The weight of their eternal vigilance pressed upon him, but it wasn't a burden. It was a truth. And then, with that realization, Elias, or whatever he had become, understood his duty. He understood the nature of the forest. The forest was not simply alive. It was a sentience, a living consciousness that required protection. The veil between life and death, between the living world and the beyond, had to be kept intact. The Watcher had always stood as a guardian of that veil. The Watcher's role was to ensure that no one crossed it. No one wandered into the forbidden spaces between the worlds. No one sought the dark power that rested beneath the forest, waiting for the right soul to awaken it. Elias was that soul. And now, he would watch. From the shadows, from the spaces between the trees, from the very air itself. He would see all who ventured too close to the heart of the forest, and he would decide their fate. Elias turned, the weight of his new identity settling around him like a cloak as he began his eternal vigil. There would be no rest. There would be no escape. The forest would always need a Watcher, and he was the one who had been chosen. The ground beneath him trembled in quiet approval, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the voice of the ancient Watchers. You are not alone, Elias. You never were. And with that, the forest settled into a deep, timeless silence. For the first time since the pact had been made, Elias could feel the weight of the centuries pressing down on him. He was no longer just a part of the forest, no longer simply a Watcher of the world. He had become the forest, an extension of its will, its very spirit. And yet, despite the profound change, there was a gnawing emptiness that lingered in the hollow of his chest. It wasn't a physical emptiness, nor was it the absence of the man he had been. It was something deeper, something older. In his heart, Elias could sense it, the lingering presence of the ancient force that had shaped the Watchers before him, a force that existed beyond the realms of human understanding. The forest had changed him, yes, but there was something else, something unspeakable that he was meant to protect, something beneath the earth, hidden in the roots, buried in the darkness. A malevolent force that no one, not even the Watchers, had ever fully comprehended. And it was beginning to stir. As Elias moved deeper into the forest, he became keenly aware of the passage of time, or rather, the lack of it. The forest seemed to stretch on forever. The trees were older than the stars, and the air was thick with the scent of decay and rebirth. Every step he took felt as though he were sinking deeper into a dream, the line between reality and fantasy blurring until nothing felt real at all. The forest had no seasons, no days or nights. It existed in a perpetual state of twilight. The moon had long since abandoned the sky, leaving only the dim glow of the red altar to cast its eerie light on the path. In the absence of time, Elias's mind wandered, drawn into thoughts that were not his own, thoughts that echoed from the voices of previous Watchers and those who had come before them. They spoke of the force beneath the earth, of the thing that lay dormant, its hunger slowly growing. It had always been there, buried in the deep places of the world, waiting, watching. But now, with Elias as its new guardian, its appetite had begun to awaken, and there was little time left before it would rise again. Elias could feel the vibrations of the earth, a faint pulse beneath his feet, like the beating of a heart far, larger than any human's. The ground was shifting, stirring in its eternal slumber, and he knew, without understanding how he knew, that the ancient presence that had once been bound was no longer content to stay hidden. It was calling to him. Now the whispers, faint at first, began to gather once more, curling around him like the mist that crept through the trees in the early hours of dawn. His name was not called this time, nor were the whispers seeking his attention in the way they had before. No, this time they were a warning. "It is coming," they whispered, each voice fragmented and broken as though speaking from a great distance. "The Watcher, you must prepare." Elias felt his chest tighten as he pressed forward, feeling the weight of the voices pressing down on him. They were growing louder, more frantic. He had no choice now but to follow them, as though his very being were drawn by an invisible thread that led him deeper into the heart of the forest. The trees parted as he passed, their branches swaying in unnatural rhythm, as if acknowledging his presence, but they too seemed unsettled. The closer he drew to the heart of the forest, the thicker the air became. A sense of unease rolled over him like a wave, and his mind raced with questions he was unable to answer. Suddenly, the path before him narrowed, leading him into a shadowed clearing. There the ground was cracked and scarred. The earth rent open as though something had been trying to break free. The red glow of the altar flickered faintly in the distance, but it was not the altar that held his gaze now. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a figure. The shape was barely more than a shadow, tall and elongated, its form shrouded in the kind of darkness that seemed to devour light. For a moment, Elias's breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the force the Watchers had spoken of, the entity that lurked in the deep places, the one whose awakening would bring an end to everything. He could feel it now, pulsing through the ground beneath him, reaching into his very bones, as if it were testing him, probing for weakness. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and its presence seemed to stretch the fabric of reality itself. Its face, or what Elias could feel was its face, was shrouded in shadow. But there was something about it that made his heart race, something that told him this was not an entity of flesh and blood. No, this was something older, something that had never known the warmth of the sun. Its body, if it could be called a body, seemed to shimmer, to flicker like a reflection in dark water. Elias could feel the tendrils of fear creeping into his mind, but there was something else, something even stronger, a pull. The darkness, the entity, called to him in a way that felt familiar. He could feel the bonds of the pact between him and the forest tightening, binding him to this ancient force, and yet he felt no true control. The pact was more than just a promise. It was a tether, an anchor to a world beyond his comprehension, a link between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead. And now, it was his duty to protect that link. But the entity, it was something else entirely. The whispers filled his mind once more, louder than before, but they were no longer warnings. "It is waking. You must stop it." The words clattered together like 1,000 stones falling down a mountain. The urgency was unmistakable. The entity's presence swelled, and Elias felt the weight of its power, a crushing, unbearable force that seemed to radiate from the ground itself, filling the clearing with a palpable tension. Elias stepped forward, drawn by the force of the thing that stood before him. But the closer he came, the stronger the sensation of dread became. There was something wrong here, something that should not have been. He could feel it in his very soul, a sickness that curled at the edges of his consciousness. And yet, the whispers, his ancestors told him that this was his destiny. This was the moment he had been chosen for. He had no choice. The figure in the clearing seemed to shift, its dark tendrils of shadow writhing in the air like serpents. And for the first time since the pact had been made, Elias heard it speak. "You are the Watcher, but you are not the only one." The words filled the air like thunder, shaking the ground beneath his feet, and Elias staggered back, his heart pounding in his chest. This was not the entity he had expected. This was not the ancient force of the forest alone. There was something else here, something darker, something older, a force that had existed before even the trees. And then the darkness moved, the ground trembled again, the earth splitting open with a deafening crack. The figure in front of Elias began to dissolve, unraveling like mist in the wind. But as it did, something far worse began to emerge, something from the depths, something vast, something that would not be controlled, and it was looking directly at him. The entity's gaze was an abyss, a chasm of utter darkness where there were no stars, no light, only the consuming weight of an infinite nothing. Elias felt it first in his chest, that crushing pressure, as though the air itself were being drawn out of him. His limbs went numb, and a chill crawled up his spine, colder than any wind he had ever known, colder than death itself. The shadows that had surrounded the figure in the clearing began to pulse, undulating like liquid darkness. They seemed to liquefy and reform in patterns too chaotic, too alien for his mind to comprehend. Elias felt the pull of it, the lure of the emptiness that stretched beyond time and reason. There was no escaping it. No place to run, no safe place to hide. He was within it now, inside it. The forest around him had gone silent, as though holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The ground beneath his feet trembled again, more violently this time, and the altar, his altar, the one he had protected, the one that had anchored him to the forest, flickered with a strange, sickly light. Its red glow grew sharper, brighter, casting long, sharp shadows across the clearing. And in the center of it all stood that thing, the dark entity that had once been only a whisper in the wind, a shadow in the forest. But now it had grown too large, too powerful to remain hidden. It was here, and now it was awake. Elias's heart pounded in his ears as he tried to take a step backward, his body locked in place by the overwhelming presence of the thing in front of him. He couldn't breathe, he couldn't think. His vision blurred, the trees around him turning into a smear of shapes and colors, twisting in ways that made no sense. But it wasn't the forest that was warping, it was him. The realization slammed into him with brutal clarity. The pact, the transformation, the role he had taken as the Watcher, it hadn't been an elevation. No, it had been a trap. He had been bound to this place, this forest, yes, but it wasn't a guardian he had become. He had become a vessel, a conduit for something ancient, something that had never truly been bound in the first place. Something that had been waiting for someone like him. The shadow in the clearing writhed, as if it were aware of his thoughts, as if it were feeding on his fear. Its presence filled the clearing, expanding, reaching into the earth, stretching its influence out like the tendrils of a root. A low hum emanated from the very center of the void, a sound that scraped at the edges of his mind, turning his thoughts into a broken, jagged mess. The hum grew louder, building to a deafening roar that seemed to pulse through every inch of him. And then it spoke. You are the Watcher. You were always meant to be. Its voice was deep, resonant, an echo of 1,000 forgotten memories, the voice of the land itself, only twisted, corrupted. But you were never meant to protect. You were meant to serve. Elias stumbled back, his breath caught in his throat. Serve? What did it mean? The darkness in front of him twisted, taking on an almost humanoid shape. At first the form was a mere silhouette, shifting and undulating like smoke, but as it continued to grow, it became more defined, more solid. At first it seemed to have no real shape at all. Its edges were constantly shifting, like water in a storm. And then it clicked. Its outline became a figure, not one of flesh, but something older, something other. It was an abomination, a twisted thing, as if the shadows themselves had taken on a form that could barely comprehend the shape of a human body. It had too many limbs, too many eyes, too many mouths, all twitching and snapping like hungry insects. Its skin, if it could be called skin, was a shifting, pulsing mass of darkness, a chaotic void that seemed to swallow the very light that touched it, and yet Elias could not tear his gaze away. You feel it, don't you? The entity's voice rasped like 1,000 grating stones, and Elias felt something stir deep inside him, something primal. The hunger, the need, the thirst for something greater than this world. You have always felt it, Elias. Always. Elias's mind reeled. The hunger, it was something he had always known, something he had felt deep in his chest, in his very bones. He had never understood it. But now, as the entity's voice wrapped itself around his thoughts, he knew. He had never truly belonged to the world of men. He had always been drawn to something darker, something hidden beneath the earth, beneath the trees, the whispers of the forest, the call of the Watcher. It had always been a part of him. But now it wasn't just the forest calling him. It was the thing beneath the forest, the thing that had been buried long ago. The truth hit him like a physical blow, and he staggered back. This dark force was not the thing that needed protection. It was the thing that had always protected the forest, the land, the pact. It had been slumbering for eons, waiting for the right moment to awaken, to break free, to consume. And Elias had been its chosen vessel. The true role of the Watcher had never been to protect. It had been to bind, to keep the dark force buried, hidden, waiting. But now that the entity had awoken, Elias realized the truth. He had been chosen not to protect the world from the dark power beneath, but to serve as its gatekeeper. The Watcher's role was never to stand between the world of the living and the void. It was to open that gate. The entity's form twisted and expanded, and Elias could hear it laughing, a sound that scraped against his mind, breaking his thoughts into fragments. The laughter was not joyful, not mocking, but something far more terrible. It was inevitable. The entity was no longer just a presence. It was a force, a being with intent, with purpose. And it was here now, in the world of the living. And Elias was its bridge. His vision blurred again, and the world seemed to pulse, distorting around him. The shadows stretched longer, the ground beneath him rippling like liquid. A flicker of memories surged through him, memories of his life before this, before the pact. His humanity felt like a distant echo, like a life lived by someone else. He remembered the sound of bird song, the feel of rain on his skin, the warmth of sunlight. And then it was gone. The darkness filled his mind once again. "You belong to me now," the entity whispered. "You will open the gate. You will let me in." Elias's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he struggled, fighting against the weight of the darkness, against the thing that was trying to consume him. But there was no fight left in him. He was beyond resistance. There was no choice. And then, with one final shudder, the forest shifted. The ground cracked open, splitting beneath his feet, and Elias felt himself falling, spiraling downward into the abyss. He was no longer the watcher. He was the opened gate, and the darkness flooded in. Elias had no sense of time, no sense of direction, as the world around him collapsed into chaos. The ground beneath his feet twisted and buckled, warping like some nightmare that refused to let go of its grip. He felt his body, his soul, being torn apart by the pressure of it, each fragment of his being pulled into the void. His vision swirled, now dark, now burning, now nothing. And he felt himself disintegrating, becoming part of the rift itself. The world had lost its color, the trees, the earth, even the air. They were no longer real. They were images fading, in and out, fractured and distant. The only thing that remained was the oppressive blackness, the choking void that seemed to consume every particle of his being. And through it all, the whispering continued. It wasn't a single voice anymore, nor was it a symphony of voices. It was everything. "You are the gate now." Elias tried to scream, but no sound came. His body was no longer his own, his muscles locked in place, his mind barely a flicker against the vastness of the force pulling at him. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever felt. There was no pain, no relief, only the unbearable sensation of being swallowed whole. There was no choice. "You have always been ours." The voices echoed, melding with his thoughts, merging with his every pulse, every heartbeat. They weren't just words anymore, they were his truth. His entire existence had been nothing more than a preparation for this moment. The thing that had been the watcher was gone. What stood now, what was now, was the gate. Elias's eyes opened, but all he could see was darkness, a suffocating blackness that pressed in on him from all sides. His arms and legs felt weightless, as though he were floating in space. But no, he could feel the subtle vibration in the air, the faintest tremor in the ground beneath him. There was still something alive, something moving. He felt a deep, unholy hum vibrating in the air around him, as if the very fabric of the world was alive, stretching its limits, breaking its rules. Then, a flash of light, sharp, cruel, and blinding, cut through the void. He gasped, a violent inhale of breath that shattered the silence. His eyes burned as the darkness receded in slow pulses, revealing a fractured, warping landscape. The trees were still here, but they were different, twisted, their bark gnarled and black, their roots winding and coiling like serpents. The once sturdy ground was now cracked open, with rivers of red and black running beneath the surface. The scent of rot hung thick in the air, and the air itself felt wrong, stale, cold and stale with the stench of decay. The very sky above him was a deep, sickly orange, as though the sun had been replaced by a burning wound in the heavens, and there, in the midst of it all, stood the altar, the same red stone, the same crooked shape, but now it pulsed with energy, like the beating heart of some ancient, malevolent being. The energy in the air was thick, electric, as if the very land had been desecrated. Elias could feel it seeping into his skin, into his bones, as if the land itself were trying to claim him, to make him part of it. The whispers grew louder, and now they were not just words. They were images, flashes of faces, forgotten moments, fractured glimpses of lives that had come before him. "We are here," the words burned in his mind. "The breach is complete. We are free." Elias felt himself falter. His vision was blurry again, but there was no denying it. The forest had opened itself, and the rift between worlds had been torn apart. He could feel the ancient power spilling into the land, could feel the presence of something terrible and incomprehensible taking root in this place. The very atmosphere was thick with it, a saturation of power, of wrongness. Something massive had awakened in the depths of the forest, something that had been waiting, its slumber now broken. It was an entity, vast and unshaped, older than the land itself, and now that it was free, it would reclaim what had been lost. The trees groaned and shook, and the earth itself seemed to recoil from the weight of it. "The void is upon you. There is no place for you to hide." Elias felt the ground beneath him tremble as the creature, a thing too vast to comprehend, shifted in the distance. He couldn't see it yet, but the air moved around him, as though something was shifting, as though something was growing beneath the earth. And then he felt it, the pull. It wasn't just the dark entity pulling him in now. It was the land, the forest, the rift itself. It was reaching for him, its tendrils wrapping around his heart, squeezing tighter with each breath. The whispers again, loud and insistent, filled his mind, and Elias could feel them pressing against his skull, pushing deeper into his consciousness. "You will not escape it. You will not escape us." But the voice, something was wrong with the voice. It wasn't the same whispering he had heard before. It was sharper, more malevolent, less human. It had changed. It had changed. Suddenly there was a movement in the distance. Something shifted, a ripple in the air, and then Elias saw it. It was not a shape, not a thing, but something far worse, a void, an empty space that grew larger with each passing moment. The air around it grew colder, the ground beneath it buckling as though it were being pulled into the rift. The rift was alive. The immense yawning void began to stretch upward, its form shifting with grotesque, impossible motions, like liquid moving in ways no earthly matter should. The ground cracked and shattered beneath it, and Elias felt himself falling. The gravity was pulling him, dragging him toward it, pulling him into the heart of that terrible, shifting darkness. His body, his soul, was at the mercy of the rift. "You will become one with us," the voice said, louder now. "Your mind will be lost, and your body will merge with the dark. You will no longer be a watcher. You will be our vessel." The coldness around Elias deepened, pressing in on him like a vice. The pressure was too much. He could feel the splitting of his being, the fragmenting of his soul, being pulled apart by forces beyond understanding. The world was ripping, and then there was a flash of memory, unbidden, unwanted. The face of a woman, soft, warm, her eyes full of worry. Her name was lost to him now, but he could feel the weight of her absence. His heart twisted with the memory. Was it regret? Was it loss? No, no. This was not him anymore. This was the gate, and it was wide open. Elias's mind was a shattered glass, each piece of himself slipping away like sand through his fingers. The rift, the yawning void, pulled at him, tugging at the very fabric of his being. The land around him was breaking apart, and the air itself seemed to warp, warping the sounds of the world into a jagged symphony of screams and whispers. He was falling now, deeper and deeper into the fracture, the place where nothing had form, where there was no gravity and no time. Only an endless, relentless pull, the memories, the fragments of his past life flickered and vanished like fleeting shadows. Faces blurred, names faded, all but one thing: the hunger, the gnawing emptiness, the cold hunger of the forest that had been inside him from the moment he'd stepped foot in it. But it was no longer his. It was him. He had been consumed, transformed into the thing that had been waiting to return to this world. The forest, the altar, the pact, all of it had been lies. Lies to keep the power asleep, to keep the breach from breaking wide open. But that had been before Elias had chosen to unlock the gate, before the Watcher had become the harbinger. The ground beneath him fractured once more, and Elias felt the pieces of the world around him collapse. The void stretched, growing larger, reaching farther, its insatiable hunger consuming the very earth itself. He could feel the rift, feel it breathing, a pulse so vast it drowned out every thought. In his mind, the walls of the world, of the reality he had once known, were dissolving, their edges curving inward, as though the entire landscape had been pulled into the breach, its bones cracking under the weight of the infinite void. And yet, within the ever-growing dark, Elias felt alive. It was as though he had become part of the very thing he had feared, part of the hunger, the dark power that now flowed through him, that sought to claim not just the forest, but the entire world. He had become a vessel for it, no longer a man, no longer the Watcher, but the very thing that tore through the veil between realms. He wanted to scream, to fight it, to return to the person he had been before. But all that remained was the hunger, the darkness that clung to him, swarming in his mind, taking control. The trees, once towering and proud, now stood as broken, twisted husks. Their bark peeled away like ash, their limbs gnarled into shapes that defied reason. The once green leaves had become rotted husks, blackened and curling. The forest, Elias realized, was dying, but it was also changing. Everything around him was shifting, being transformed by the rift. In the distance, through the thick haze of shadow and decay, he saw a figure emerging. It was tall, too tall, with limbs that stretched far beyond the bounds of human proportions. It moved with an eerie grace, its body swaying like a tree in a storm. Its head was obscured, but Elias could feel its eyes, the presence of its gaze, cold and unblinking, settling upon him. It did not speak, not in words, but in the quiet, gnawing sensation that seeped into his bones. The thing, the creature, was coming closer. Elias could feel its hunger, feel its need to feed, to consume. He could feel its eyes on him, burning through him, as though it had always been waiting for him. It had always known he would be the one to unlock the gate. As it drew closer, the void pulsed once more, sending a shockwave through the air. The ground trembled, cracking wider, as if the earth itself was beginning to tear apart. Elias's vision blurred again, and he felt himself falling, spiraling downward. Was it the void pulling him deeper? Was it the creature's gaze? No. It was him. The transformation was complete. His body was no longer human, no longer anything recognizable. His limbs had elongated, his fingers warped into jagged claws. His face, his very skin, had turned ashen, mottled with black veins, pulsating with the dark power that flowed within him. His breath had become shallow, rasping. His chest felt hollow, empty, as though the very essence of him had been consumed by the dark. There was no escape. The figure loomed above him now, its shape flickering in and out of focus, as though it were made from the very shadows around him. Its mouth, a jagged hole, a gaping maw, opened wide. Elias could hear the low, guttural sound of its breath, the deep, echoing growl that seemed to reverberate through the rift itself. And then, from the depths of the void, came a voice, a whisper, faint and almost imperceptible, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. You are not the end. Elias froze. The voice, it wasn't the same as before. It was different. It wasn't the entity that had risen from the forest. It wasn't the thing that had consumed him. No, this voice was something else. It was human. The figure before him, whatever it was, whatever it had become, paused. The shadows around it shifted, retreating slightly as if hesitant. The pulse of the void slowed, and for a moment, the rift seemed to shrink, like the very fabric of reality was holding its breath. The creature's body twitched, its movements no longer fluid but jerky, almost hesitant, and then the voice spoke again, louder, more forceful. You are not the end. You are the beginning. The words sent a shiver down Elias's spine, but not because of their threat. No, it was something else. There was a sense of familiarity in those words, something he couldn't place, something he should have known. But it was lost to him now, buried beneath the weight of the darkness, the endless hunger that gnawed at his mind. He didn't know if he should run or if he should stay. He didn't know if he was still Elias at all. We do not end, the voice whispered. We begin. The breach is open. You are the first. Elias felt something stir inside him, a memory, a flicker of recognition. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, the memory of a promise, the memory of a choice. He had made a choice, had chosen the forest, chosen the pact, chosen the hunger, the darkness. But what had he really chosen? The creature stretched its long limbs toward him, and Elias's pulse quickened. Its movements were graceful, unnerving, and as it drew closer, it spoke one last time. This is only the beginning. The gate is open. The world will fall. The darkness surged around him, wrapping around him like a cloak, pulling him further into its depths. The last thing Elias heard, as the world swallowed him whole, was the soft, crackling whisper of the forest itself. And then, everything was silent. The rift was complete, the breach was open. Silence. It was so complete, so absolute, that Elias could no longer be sure whether he had simply ceased to exist, or whether the world itself had. The crushing emptiness of it overwhelmed him, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but the sensation of being stretched thin, as though the very fabric of his being was being pulled apart into the void. The darkness had consumed him, but then, slowly the blackness began to recede, pulling back in waves, like a tide that had once rushed. In too fast, the air around him began to thrum, a low hum that vibrated in the depths of his bones. The rift had not closed. No. Instead, it was growing. The breach between worlds was widening, its influence seeping into every crevice of his body, into every thought that tried to grasp reality. Elias tried to breathe, but his lungs felt foreign. Each inhalation came as if his body had forgotten what it meant to take in air, as if it was something new, something unfamiliar. The air tasted wrong, thick with a metallic tang, the scent of rust and decay hanging in the air like the remnants of something long dead. He wasn't in the forest anymore. No, this place, this void, was something else. It was a realm between realms, a space that had no name, no place. It felt endless, a vast stretch of dark, jagged land that seemed to ripple like a wound, the very earth torn open and dripping with darkness. The sky above was an unnatural shade of violet, swirling and shifting as though it were alive, sick, twisting clouds moving in erratic patterns. But it was the ground beneath him that caught his attention. It was no longer solid. Instead, Elias stood on something that resembled shifting smoke, dark and shapeless, beneath his feet, the ground constantly changing, unstable. It felt like walking on liquid, or something far more sinister, a surface that had no true form, no true consistency. His footfalls left ripples that spread out in all directions, vanishing into the unknown, and yet he stood. There was something oppressive about the way the air felt, like the space around him was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But what? Elias felt a tug, no, a pull, a gnawing sensation in his chest, deep within his very being, as if the rift were drawing him into itself, its hunger never sated. He tried to resist, tried to move forward, but something was locking him in place. Something was watching him. And then he saw it. At first, it was a flicker at the edge of his vision, a slight movement, just outside the periphery of his sight. But when he turned his head, the thing was gone. A trick of the light, perhaps. Or was it something else? But it wasn't long before he saw it again. Only this time, it wasn't just one thing. There were many figures, pale, translucent beings, drifting like smoke across the shifting ground. They moved slowly, gliding as if they were suspended by some unseen force. Their bodies were thin, elongated, with limbs too long for their frail frames. Elias couldn't make out their faces at first. They were blurred, indistinct, as though their features were constantly shifting, never fully settled. But one thing was clear: they were watching him. The flickering figures didn't move toward him. No, they simply hovered in place, silent and still, their eyes locked onto him. Elias felt the weight of those eyes, though, even from a distance. It was as if each gaze was a physical thing, a force that pressed down on him, suffocating him with its intensity. He wanted to look away, but something deep inside him held him, there as though the act of turning his head would reveal something even worse. One of the figures stepped forward. It was different from the others, more solid, more real. Its outline shimmered like a heat mirage, but its form remained intact, distinct. It was taller, more composed, its limbs moving with unnerving precision. The figure's face was obscured by a veil of dark mist, but its eyes, those eyes, burned. Through the mist, they glowed faintly, an otherworldly, unnatural red. Elias couldn't move, couldn't look away. The voice came to him, not spoken aloud, but inside his mind. It wasn't a voice made of sound, it was a sensation, like the voice was part of the very atmosphere. It was cold, hollow, and rasping, like wind moving through an empty, broken cathedral. You are the one who opened the gate, the one who woke us. Elias's heart skipped a beat. The figure stepped forward again, its long arms stretching toward him, its fingers elongated and impossibly thin. The shadows surrounding it seemed to cling to it, wrapping around its body like tendrils, crawling up its limbs like living things. You are the first, it whispered, but you will not be the last. Elias struggled, a rising panic suffocating him. What was happening? Where was he? Was this what the forest had truly been hiding? What it had been building toward? Was this what the Watcher had been trying to stop all along? His mind was racing, but the weight of the creature's presence made it difficult to think, to focus. Every question felt futile, meaningless in the face of the terrible, unknowable force that loomed before him. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature paused. It tilted its head, its red eyes narrowing, as if considering something. "You are not yet ready," it murmured, its voice shifting, becoming deeper, more resonant, like 1,000 whispers all at once. "You will be, but not yet." The ground beneath Elias's feet shifted again, the dark mist swirling around his legs. He could feel it, the pull of something deep, deep inside him, like a knot tightening in his chest. The air pressed in on him, thick and suffocating, like the walls of the world were closing in, and Elias felt himself falling, not through space, but through time. In a single, dreadful instant, the creatures around him faded, dissolving into the mist. The ground trembled, and he felt himself sinking, faster and faster, deeper and deeper, until there was nothing but the thrum of the void surrounding him. And then the world shifted. The world bent and broke around Elias, every shift, every movement, disorienting him further. It was as though reality itself was a tattered cloak, unraveling at the seams. His mind, once so sharp, was now adrift in a sea of fractured images, echoes of memories that no longer felt like his own. His body was not his. Every part of him felt foreign, as if it too had been reclaimed by something far darker. The hunger inside him gnawed at his insides, but not in the way hunger was familiar. It was a hunger for something deeper, something older, something that had always been there, waiting for this moment. Elias felt like a puppet, caught in the strings of some unseen force, struggling to make sense of the world around him. But no clarity came. Every step he took seemed to lead him further into the spiral of decay, deeper into the distortion of reality. It was as if the forest, the creatures, the very air around him had begun to twist and ripple into a state of perpetual motion, an endless cycle of existence that could not be undone. And then, there it was. At first, it was just a flicker, a pale light that shimmered like the reflection of a dying star. But Elias felt it. Its presence was like the pressure of 1,000 eyes watching, piercing into his very soul. The light pulsed again, brighter this time, as if calling to him, drawing him in with an irresistible pull. He followed it, his feet, moving of their own accord, not even registering the pain in his limbs, the exhaustion that had long since settled into his bones. He didn't think, didn't question. He simply moved, as though his body was being controlled by forces he could no longer comprehend. As he drew closer, the air around him began to hum, vibrating with an unnatural energy. The space itself felt alive, as if the world was watching him. His heart raced in his chest, but there was no more fear, only a cold, numbing certainty that he had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. And then the light revealed itself. It was not a light at all, not in the way Elias had imagined. No, it was more like a presence, an entity that shone without ever truly illuminating. It was pale, opaque, shifting like liquid crystal. At first it looked like a door, or perhaps a window, but upon closer inspection it was neither. It was a tear in the very fabric of time and space, a wound, open and pulsing. Elias stood before it, transfixed. His pulse quickened as his mind reeled to understand what he was seeing. It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss so deep, so vast, that nothing could survive its pull. And then he heard it, the sound that shattered the silence. It was a whisper. But not just any whisper, it was a voice. His voice. "Help me." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating through the air like a painful pulse. Elias's eyes widened. He had heard it before, heard it in the whispering winds of the forest, heard it in the void that had swallowed him. It had been the voice that had called to him, pulling him toward the breach, toward the rift. But now it was different. The voice was desperate. Elias's heart skipped a beat. That voice, it wasn't just calling to him, it was calling from him. He was standing in front of the very rift that had opened, the very rift that had consumed him. But now, instead of a dark hole in the world, it had become a distorted mirror, reflecting something twisted and wrong. In the pale light that emanated from it, Elias saw a figure, himself, but distorted, ravaged, like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. His features were broken, fractured, twisted in unnatural ways. His eyes were empty, hollow, dark pits of despair. His body was stretched, unnaturally long, covered in a thin, translucent skin that shimmered like the light itself. The figure, he, was screaming, but Elias could hear no sound. The distortion in the rift swallowed it all, making everything echo into a hollow silence. For the briefest moment, Elias felt a sense of recognition, a deep, sickening sense of familiarity with the thing on the other side. It was him. It was Elias, what he had become, what he was destined to be. He had opened the rift. He had chosen to awaken it, and now, the entity that had taken root inside him, the hunger, the shadow, was breaking through. It had always been part of him. Elias felt the darkness inside him surge once more, consuming him with an intensity that threatened to tear him apart. He was slipping, losing himself, drowning in the weight of it. The void around him stretched and expanded, wrapping him in its suffocating embrace, pulling him further toward the mirror, the rift, the doorway to... What? The light flickered again. The figure in the rift spoke, its voice coming not from its mouth but from the depths of Elias's mind, as if it had always been there, hiding, waiting. You are the gatekeeper now. You have opened the way. We are coming. Elias's heart raced, his breath shallow and ragged. He tried to move, to fight, but his limbs felt like stone, his body locked in place. He could only watch as the rift widened further, the edges of reality warping, bending, breaking apart. The boundary between the worlds, the barrier between the living and the dead, was weakening. The forest's cries, the whispers, the hunger, it was all intertwined. It had always been intertwined. The rift was not just a gateway. It was a wound, a scar in the fabric of time, and it was Elias who had torn it open. The figure inside the rift, himself, reached out toward him, its translucent fingers grazing the edges of the mirror-like surface. Elias could feel its coldness, its presence, like the touch of death itself. He screamed, but no sound came. His body, his mind was slipping away, and then, in a blinding flash, the rift consumed him whole. The world collapsed. Elias awoke, if it could even be called waking. He was lying on the ground, his body heavy, as though he had been cast aside by something far greater than himself. The air was still thick with that oppressive energy, but there was a change, a subtle shift in the way the world hummed around him. He was no longer in the rift, no longer suspended in that dark, fluid space between time and nothingness. But he wasn't in the world he had known either. Around him, the forest had changed. It had become something otherworldly, its trees bent and twisted, their bark blackened and rotted. The ground was slick with a black substance like oil or tar that pooled around his feet. The wind carried with it the scent of something rotten, the decay of life long lost, and above him, in the twisted branches of the trees, something moved. It was not the wind. It was them. The figures, no longer flickering or distant, but real, solid. Their eyes gleamed with that same unholy red glow. They were watching him, surrounding him. There were more of them now, their bodies thin and broken, like the twisted trees that surrounded them. And at the center of them all, Elias could feel something stirring, something rising from the depths of the earth, a power, ancient and hungry, one that had not been awakened in eons. He was not free, not yet. The hunger was still inside him, and now it had spread. The forest was alive, its very essence twisted into something dark, something unholy. The rift had changed everything, and now Elias was its keeper. Elias stood in the heart of the forest, the twisted, unnatural trees stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands, reaching for a forgotten eternity. The black, tar-like substance that oozed from the earth seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, like the very heartbeat of something ancient and malignant. It was as if the land itself had succumbed to the hunger, drawn into the abyss that Elias had unwittingly opened. His body felt heavy, unnaturally so, as though the air itself were thickening, forcing its way into his lungs, dragging him down. His arms hung limply by his sides, the skin tight across his bones, and his chest ached with the terrible weight of the darkness that now inhabited him. The whispers had not stopped. They never would. Around him, the figures, those pale, twisted beings with their hollow, burning eyes, moved in unison, circling him like vultures. Their presence was suffocating, their attention a constant pressure that bore down on him from every direction. Yet Elias could not move. He was rooted to the spot, his feet seemingly fused to the blackened earth, his mind struggling to make sense of the horror unfolding before him. They were waiting. The forest had been waiting for this moment, for the opening of the rift, for the moment when it would claim what was always meant to be its own. "You are the keeper now," a voice whispered. His own voice, or something that sounded like it, but deeper, more resonant, as though it came from the very core of the earth. "You have opened the door, and we are the first." Elias's mind reeled with the weight of the words. Keeper. That word, like a curse, echoed inside him, filling him with an unbearable sense of inevitability. He had chosen this path, even though he hadn't known it. He had been drawn here, to this cursed place, by something far older than the forest itself, the Watcher. It had known. It had known all along that Elias was destined to be the key, the one who would open the door to the beyond. But now there was no going back. The ground trembled beneath him as the figures drew closer. They did not speak, but their presence was a message in itself. They had come for him. They had come to claim what was theirs. A faint, distant sound echoed through the forest. It was the wind. No, it was more than that. It was a voice, but one that was not a voice at all. It was like the cry of 1,000 souls, twisted and distorted by the very rift Elias had opened. The sound was in his bones, in his very blood, and it called to him in a way that nothing else had. The air seemed to crackle with the intensity of it, and Elias felt himself being pulled, a magnetic force drawing him into the center of the gathering. "You will be one of us," the voice repeated, its tone growing stronger, more insistent. "The gatekeeper, the first among us. You will be the key to what comes next." The darkness within him, the hunger, stirred. It was no longer a vague presence, no longer an abstract force lurking in the recesses of his mind. It had grown, swelling inside him until it was impossible to separate it from himself. It was no longer Elias. It was them, and it was all-consuming. He could feel it. The hunger wanted out. It wanted to feed. The figures surrounded him, their pale bodies hovering like smoke, their eyes boring into him. Elias could feel the warmth of their gaze. No, it wasn't warmth. It was something worse. It was a searing cold, like ice running through his veins, hollowing him out from the inside. For the first time, Elias understood the true purpose of the rift. It wasn't just a doorway. It was an invitation to those who had been waiting for eons to return, to reclaim what was theirs. The Watcher had been their prisoner, and now he had freed them. But in doing so, Elias had sealed his fate. He was the keeper now, the first of many, and there would be more. "You will bring them," the figure with the red eyes whispered. The words wrapped around Elias like chains. "You will open the way piece by piece until all is consumed." It was then that he understood. The horror was not just within the forest. It was everywhere, stretching across time and space, tied to the very fabric of the world. Every crack in the earth, every whisper in the wind, every shadow cast by the trees, all were echoes of the hunger. The hunger had always been there, waiting, dormant, until he awoke it. And now it was his burden to bear. His fingers twitched, the hunger clawing at his skin, urging him to reach out and claim his place among them. He could feel the power of the rift surging through him like an electrical current that threatened to break him apart. His mind was a blur of visions, flashes of memories that weren't his, of lives that had never been lived. His body trembled with the overwhelming sense that he was becoming something else, something more, something terrible. His eyes snapped open, and the world around him seemed to fold in on itself. The figures that surrounded him were no longer distant, no longer separate. They were part of him. They were inside him, and he was inside them, their whispers seeping into his mind like poison. Their voices blended together into a single discordant hum, a sound that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. Elias's breath caught in his throat. His mouth opened, but it was not his voice that spoke. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of the hunger. "We are one now." The forest groaned, the very earth cracking open to reveal the dark, pulsing core beneath. The trees that surrounded Elias bent and twisted in unnatural ways, their bark splitting, their roots stretching deeper into the earth. The blackened substance that oozed from the ground began to rise, coiling like tendrils, seeking, waiting. The rift had expanded. It was no longer just a tear in the fabric of the world. It was a presence, alive and hungry. The forest was alive, its veins pulsing with the same dark energy that now thrummed within Elias's chest. He could feel it now, the pull of it, deep in his soul. The hunger had consumed him, and in doing so, it had made him its vessel, its key to the next phase. The rift was no longer just a breach in space. It was an infection, spreading like rot, devouring everything in its path. And Elias was the first of many. The figures gathered around him, their faces blurred and shifting, their forms flickering like flames in the wind. But in that moment, Elias felt no fear, no hesitation. He understood now he was meant for this. He had always been meant for this. The hunger was his to command, and the forest was his to shape. The figures reached out to him, their pale hands touching his skin, and in that touch, Elias felt himself change. He could feel his body shifting, reshaping, merging with them, becoming something more, something that was no longer human. And as the forest creaked and groaned around him, as the rift pulsed with dark energy, Elias realized something. He was not the last of the keepers. He was not even the first. He was the beginning. The opening of the rift had been a catalyst, a spark. Now the forest would spread, the hunger would grow, and soon there would be nothing left but darkness. The figures around him whispered once more, their voices blending into a single, horrifying chant, "We are coming." Elias closed his eyes, and the forest consumed him. You're deep into the story now, and the horrors are only escalating. If you're still with us, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell us where you're listening from in the comments. Who else is staying up late to face this nightmare? Settle in. The terror continues. Story 2. The tires hummed steadily on the long, empty stretch of road. The sun had barely kissed the horizon when Lisa's tired eyes flickered to the glowing GPS screen. The route was simple enough. Take a left at the fork, head straight, and they'd arrive at her parents' house in less than an hour. But then the signal faltered and the screen blinked, showing only a vague, unmarked road stretching into the wilderness ahead. It was as though the device had abandoned them entirely. "I think we're lost," Lisa murmured, glancing at her partner Jason, whose furrowed brow reflected the same unease she felt. "I'm sure it's fine," Jason replied, eyes still on the road. His tone tried to sound casual, but even he couldn't hide the creeping doubt. The highway they were on had already begun to feel far too isolated, swallowed by dense trees and vast emptiness. Montana was known for its sprawling nature, but this felt different. A dead stretch, even for rural standards. They hadn't passed a single other car in miles. "Let's take the next turn," Lisa suggested, her voice growing shaky. "It'll probably resync the map." But Jason wasn't listening anymore. His hands gripped the wheel tighter as the silence in the car stretched between them. The air felt thick, pressing down on their chests. Lisa glanced out the window, watching the trees grow taller, darker and closer, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes like claws reaching for the car. Minutes passed, an hour. 2? The miles blurred. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense anymore. They drove in silence, the only sound the soft hum of the engine and the occasional squeak of the tires on uneven asphalt. Then, without warning, the road opened up. In the distance, through the growing fog, a sign appeared. A faded wooden post with the words "Old Highway 27" scrawled in peeling letters. The GPS had no mention of this road. The pavement beneath their tires grew rougher, and the trees gave way to fields of dry grass, eerie in the dim light. It was as though they had turned into some forgotten part of the world, an older, unremembered place. "I don't remember seeing anything about this highway," Lisa said, her voice tight, as though she was speaking in a dream. Jason glanced at her. "Maybe it's a shortcut," he said, his attempt to reassure both of them falling flat. But the sensation of something wrong was crawling under their skin now. And then came the sound, the first sign that this wasn't just a detour, a thud. A quick, sharp sound of something heavy hitting the car roof. Jason's hand jerked on the wheel. He glanced up in the rearview mirror. Nothing. "Did you hear that?" Lisa's voice trembled. Jason nodded but said nothing. The road stretched ahead, bending to the left, then to the right, twisting as if it had a mind of its own. The sky above them darkened quickly, an unnatural, bruised grey that swallowed the fading light. And then came the first mile marker. 38. Jason sighed in relief. They weren't completely lost. They were moving forward. But then, the marker repeated. They passed another one. 38. Jason's pulse quickened. He hadn't imagined it. The mile marker was the same. "What the hell?" he muttered, his fingers pressing the steering wheel so hard his knuckles whitened. He slammed the brakes. The tires screeched in protest as they came to a halt. He pulled the car to the side, but Lisa didn't say a word. She stared at the repeating sign in disbelief, the fading reflection of it on the windshield. The air had thickened, as if time itself had stilled. Jason threw the car in reverse, but when he looked behind them, there was only emptiness. The road stretched forever. No signs, no landmarks. Nothing but the fading stretch of blacktop. They'd been moving forward all this time, hadn't they? Hadn't they? Lisa's stomach twisted. She felt it then. They weren't alone. And just as she was about to say something, the fog ahead thickened. From the mist, a small shape emerged, slowly stepping into the road. a lone deer, its eyes locked onto theirs, unblinking still. And in the quiet that surrounded them, the car's engine seemed to groan in protest. "Jason, do you see it?" Lisa whispered, but the words seemed to die on her lips. The deer didn't move, and then the whisper came. "Turn back." A cold chill swept through the car, seeping into their bones. Jason slammed the accelerator, but no matter how fast they drove, the same mile marker appeared again in the distance, and behind them, the deer was still there. The road twisted and turned, a serpentine path with no end in sight. Each time Jason glanced in the rearview mirror, the glowing eyes of the deer were still there, an unsettling beacon in the haze of fog. It hadn't moved an inch. It was as if time itself had been frozen in that moment, stretching and warping under their tires. Jason's breath quickened, the heavy pulse in his chest growing stronger with every mile marker that passed. 38, 38, 38, each one more suffocating than the last. "Jason." Lisa's voice quivered, her hand gripping the seat next to her as if anchoring herself to reality. This is impossible." He didn't reply at first, focusing on the road ahead, the unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. Something had gone terribly wrong. The fog had thickened, curling like smoke around the car, turning everything outside into shadowy shapes and distorted outlines. The road was narrowing. The trees on either side had grown taller, darker, their twisted branches now clawing at the air. Jason didn't speak. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to break free from the eerie grip of this place. But no matter how fast he went, the fog pressed in tighter. The oppressive silence filled the car, like a weight too heavy to ignore. The GPS was still dead, frozen at the same black screen that had started it all. The headlights didn't seem to pierce the fog anymore, just a pale blur stretching out into infinity. Then a low thump echoed from beneath the car. It felt like they had driven over something, but when Jason looked down, there was nothing. No tire skid, no debris in the road, just an empty, endless stretch. His heart raced. He glanced at Lisa. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Lisa nodded, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't need to say anything. She could feel it too, the presence, that gnawing sense that something was watching them. Waiting. Another thump. Jason's grip on the wheel tightened. "We're not alone here. There's something wrong with this place." The air in the car was stifling, thick, as if every breath they took drew in the weight of the surrounding darkness. The trees, once distant, were now pressing in closer, their branches scraping against the roof, their shadows long and unnatural. It felt as though the forest had somehow grown closer while they hadn't moved at all. The road was bending, twisting in impossible angles that no map could predict. Jason's mind raced, trying to find some logical explanation, but his thoughts kept spiraling back to the deer, its frozen stare, the words it had whispered. "Turn back," and the way its gaze had never wavered. Turn back. Was this warning from the land itself, or something else, something older? A chill swept through him, a sensation crawling up his spine that told him this wasn't just a road they were trapped on. This was a crossroads between worlds. Something ancient lingered here, waiting for them to make a mistake. Another mile marker. 38, Lisa gasped. This can't be real." Jason slammed his fist on the dashboard in frustration. "I'm not going insane, this is happening." He glanced at Lisa. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to find a way out." But the road showed no signs of changing. No curves, no exits, just more empty, desolate miles. The trees now seemed to move with them, shadowed figures that loomed at the edge of their vision, waiting for them to blink. The fog was closing in so thick the car's headlights barely cut through, and then, just as they thought it couldn't get worse, it did. The faint static on the radio, which had been nothing more than white noise, suddenly crackled to life. But the voice was distorted, an eerie, almost mechanical tone. "If you're hearing this, you're already too late." Lisa's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes darted to Jason, but he didn't answer. His hands were gripped so tightly around the wheel that his knuckles had turned white. He wanted to shout at the radio, tell it to shut up, but the words, "too late," echoed in his mind, cold and final. Lisa tried to switch the dial, but the static grew louder until it became a physical presence in the car, pressing against their ears, suffocating them. Her fingers fumbled for the volume knob, but no matter what she did, the voice kept coming through, each word like a weight sinking into the pit of her stomach. Too late, too late, too late. A soft, scraping sound from the roof interrupted the radio transmission, sending a shock of terror down their spines. It was faint at first, like nails on metal, gentle but persistent. Lisa turned, her breath hitching in her chest. She didn't want to look, but she couldn't help herself. Through the rear-view mirror, something moved in the fog. A shape. Not a person, but a figure. Tall, thin and twisted, almost as if it were made from the fog itself. Its limbs contorted unnaturally. Long and sharp, like something that didn't belong in the world they knew. It hovered just beyond the reach of the car's headlights, close enough to be seen, but not close enough to be real. The figure seemed to waver, shifting between reality and nightmare. Lisa's voice cracked as she whispered, "Jason, what is that?" But Jason didn't answer. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure, watching in horror as it moved closer. It was no longer just a shape. It was growing, stretching, and with each movement, the air inside the car seemed to grow colder, tighter, as if the very atmosphere was changing. And then, just as the figure was about to step into the light of the car, the headlights flickered. The figure was gone, but the air was different now. The engine sputtered, and the deer's whisper echoed once more, "Too late." The headlights flickered once more, then settled into an unsettling, dim glow. Jason's heart raced as the engine sputtered, a dry, mechanical cough that sent a ripple of panic through his chest. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, but the car crawled forward, as if it were no longer responding to his commands. The road stretched on endlessly, but now every twist and turn felt like a mockery of their desperate attempts to escape. Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears as she clutched the seat. Her mind was reeling, her thoughts a blur of terror and confusion. What was that thing?" she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was asking Jason or herself. The figure had been there, looming in the fog, a monstrous distortion of what should have been a peaceful, empty road. Jason didn't answer. He was gripping the wheel so hard his fingers were stiff with tension, his knuckles stark white. His eyes were fixed ahead, but they darted frantically from the rearview mirror to the road. The oppressive fog had returned, swirling in thick, suffocating clouds that closed in from every side. The forest around them had become a dark, whispering mass, the trees pressing closer than they had before, seeming to watch them, as if alive. Another mile marker. 38. Lisa's stomach turned. This is impossible, Jason," she said, her voice breaking. "We're stuck in a loop." Jason's grip on the wheel tightened. "We have to get out of here now." His voice was tight, but there was a desperation in it that Lisa had never heard before. His calm facade was cracking, the terror seeping through. He didn't know how much longer they could keep driving without losing themselves entirely in this place. In the thick fog, something caught his eye, an unnatural glow, a faint light shining in the distance. A gas station. A gas station. It wasn't on any map. It hadn't been there before. It had to be a hallucination, but the light was steady, casting an eerie glow through the mist, flickering just like the neon signs of a forgotten place, as if it had been waiting for them. Lisa squinted, trying to make sense of it. "Is that a gas station?" Jason didn't answer. He just turned the wheel sharply, veering toward the light, toward what felt like some bizarre hope in the midst of terror. The tires screeched as they turned onto a gravel road, the crunching sound beneath them eerie and loud in the stillness. The fog parted just slightly, revealing the structure ahead. The gas station loomed, its outline jagged against the haze, a relic from another time. The car rolled to a stop in front of the gas pumps. It was too quiet, too still. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She could see the flickering neon sign that read "Open," but the windows were dark, and the lights inside had an unsettling glow, like they were powered by something other than electricity. It felt wrong. Jason opened the car door slowly, hesitantly. The air outside was bitterly cold, sharp enough to cut through the layers of their clothing. He stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel, and walked toward the door of the station. Lisa didn't move. She couldn't. The wind moaned, as if the earth itself was in pain, and something about the sound made her want to scream, to call out to Jason, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. A sick feeling pooled in her stomach as she watched him approach the door. The silence was unbearable. No hum of traffic, no sounds of animals, not even the wind rustling in the trees. It was as if the world had gone mute, suspended in this strange, oppressive space. Jason reached the door and tried to push it open, but it didn't budge. He shoved harder, still nothing. He turned back, his face pale, eyes wide. "Locked," he said, his voice tight. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. "Then who would be running it?" she asked, glancing through the windows. It was so dark inside. No movement, no sign of anyone. It was as though the station had been abandoned, left untouched for decades, but the light still shone. The door didn't open. But then a sound. It was so soft at first, she thought she might have imagined it. A faint scraping, like something scraping against metal or glass. Lisa's eyes widened. Her hands gripped the seat in a panic. She turned quickly toward the back of the car. A shadow moved through the fog. A shadow she knew wasn't there a moment ago. Lisa's breath caught. "Jason, get back in the car." Jason looked at her, confused, but before he could respond, there was a low, almost guttural sound. A growl. It came from the woods, from somewhere near the gas station. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was close. The hairs on her neck stood on end. The growl rose, steady and menacing, and something instinctively told her to get away, now. Jason's head snapped around, his face drained of color. But then, there it was, the figure from before, the tall, thin shape moving in the distance, its limbs twisting like broken branches. It wasn't just standing there. It was coming toward them, its form bending unnaturally, stretching with every step. Lisa froze, her body paralyzed with fear. But before they could even react, the growl grew louder, closer. Something large and fast lunged from the edge of the woods, moving at terrifying speed. A massive creature, its eyes glowed like hot coals, its silhouette barely visible in the fog, charged straight toward them. Jason rushed back to the car, slamming the door shut. Behind him, he fumbled with the keys, the engine roaring to life just as the thing was almost upon them. They tore down the gravel road, but the creature's growl followed them, getting closer. The gas station, the woods, the twisted figure, they all blurred. In the rearview mirror, as the road stretched endlessly before them, twisting again, as if the earth itself was rearranging to trap them. And then, another mile marker appeared. Too late. The car raced through the night, the tires skimming the road like they were skating on glass. The creature, if it could even be called that, had vanished into the fog, its growls lingering in the car's cabin like a sickening echo. Jason's knuckles were still white from gripping the steering wheel, his foot pressing down on the pedal with a frantic desperation. But no matter how fast they drove, the road refused to end. Every curve, every mile marker was the same. The fog thickened, swirling with unnatural intent, as though the air itself had grown heavier. Lisa sat frozen in her seat, her wide eyes never leaving the rearview mirror. The creature, whatever it was, had come too close. The image of those glowing, fiery eyes haunted her, like a scar burned into her mind. And yet, there was something even more unsettling now, something far worse than the creature that had nearly caught them. The trees were moving. She was certain of it. When she glanced out the window, the silhouettes of the pines weren't just standing still. They were swaying, twisting in unnatural angles, bending and shifting in ways trees shouldn't move, almost as if they were alive, as if they were reaching out toward the car, fingers of bark and branch extending hungrily, pulling them deeper into the woods. "Jason," Lisa whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Look, the trees." He didn't look at first, eyes fixed, ahead. But then he glanced out the window and froze. The trees, those twisted forms, seemed to close in around them. The road was narrowing, and the deeper they drove, the more the woods encroached, their shadows casting long, jagged shapes across the car. "We're not going anywhere," Jason muttered, his voice tight with fear. "This doesn't make sense. We should have passed the next town by now." Lisa glanced at the GPS. The screen was still blank, the map a ghostly void that mocked their confusion. The car's headlights flickered once more, and for a moment, the road ahead became nothing but a black abyss. Lisa's throat tightened. The oppressive fog and the endless woods were swallowing them whole, and then, without warning, they passed it. Another mile marker. 38. Jason slammed his fist against the wheel, a burst of frustration breaking through his control. "I swear to God, it's like we're stuck in a nightmare." Lisa's hands trembled as she tried to steady herself. "This isn't just a nightmare, Jason. This is something else. This is real." Her voice shook with the words, but the weight of it settled like a stone in her chest. Nothing about this felt right. Nothing about this place felt human. Every sense screamed that they were trapped in some ancient force, some forgotten realm, and no matter how far they drove, they couldn't escape it. The car crept forward, the engine sputtering, as if it too were beginning to lose its will. Jason glanced at the dashboard, the needles on the fuel gauge fluctuating in erratic patterns, never quite steady, always shifting. He was too terrified to look at the time, if it even existed here. Then, ahead of them, another figure emerged. A man. He stood on the side of the road, barely visible through the dense mist. His features were indistinct, his body silhouetted against the pale glow of the headlights. His clothes were ragged, as though they had been worn for decades. His stance was strange, as if he had been standing there forever. His head tilted at an odd angle, and Lisa felt a pang of recognition, though she couldn't place it. The man didn't move. He just stood there, unmoving, his hollow gaze fixed on the car. Jason slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest as the car jolted to a stop. The figure did not flinch. "Who the hell is that?" Jason muttered, barely able to keep his voice steady. "Why is he just standing there?" Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "Don't open the window, don't talk to him." But Jason, in a sudden, impulsive motion, yanked at the door handle and shoved it open, stepping out onto the road. His boots crunched against the gravel, the sound echoing unnervingly in the stillness. Lisa's hand shot out to stop him, but she couldn't move fast enough. Her heart raced in her chest, the cold sweat trickling down her back. She watched, helpless, as Jason walked toward the figure. The man did not speak. He simply stood there, his head still tilted in a way that made Lisa's stomach churn. The fog rolled around them, thick and suffocating. A strange, sweet smell lingered in the air. Damp earth mixed with something rancid, something old, something decaying. Lisa couldn't explain it, but it made her want to gag. Jason was within arm's reach of the man now. His hand reached out tentatively, as if drawn by some invisible force. Lisa screamed, but it was too late. The figure suddenly moved. The man's face, when it came into the light, was not a face at all, but a blank, pale void. Smooth skin, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just a featureless, smooth expanse of flesh. And as Jason's fingers brushed against the man's cold, inhuman skin, the figure twisted, its body contorting unnaturally, its shape shifting like rubber pulled beyond its limits. Jason staggered back, his face frozen in horror. And that's when Lisa saw it. The man was not alone. Behind him, out of the fog, emerged another shape. A thing, long and serpentine, covered in what looked like scales made of brittle bone, twisted and jagged. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, stretching like a cavernous abyss filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. The figure's hollow face twisted again, as if to speak. But the sound that came from it was not a voice. It was a scream. It wasn't just the man. It was the road, the trees, the air itself, all screaming in a chorus of agony. Jason's breath hitched, his eyes wide with terror. He turned to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if the very earth beneath him had turned to quicksand. The creature lunged at him, its maw wide enough to swallow him whole. Lisa screamed again, her body jolting in the seat, but she couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch in horror as Jason was dragged into the fog, and then the radio crackled to life. Too late, the voice whispered again, its tone colder than the wind. It's already too late. The car's engine sputtered and died. The silence that followed was absolute. The car sat at the edge of the road, its engine dead, the soft click of the cooling metal the only sound in the suffocating silence. Lisa's breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes wide with terror, but her body had frozen, caught in a paralyzing grip of fear. The fog pressed in from every direction, thick and impenetrable, shrouding the world in a suffocating, ghostly blanket. Jason was gone, vanished into the mist, dragged away by something impossible. Lisa could hear the soft thud of her heart in her chest, each beat a painful reminder of the nightmare she was trapped in. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so hard her fingers were numb. Her mind was in a haze, a blur of terror, but deep down, there was a gnawing question that refused to leave her. Why was she still here? The radio crackled again, the same static, the same haunting voice. The words sliced through her like ice, making the hairs on her neck stand at attention. It's already too late, she snapped her head to the side, but the world outside the window remained a void, a nothingness of swirling mist and oppressive silence. Lisa closed her eyes, trying to block out the voice, the memories, the images of Jason's terrified face. She had to leave. She had to get away. There had to be a way out, but her hands, her feet refused to move. It was as if something else was controlling her body, something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. A presence in the air that whispered to her soul, telling her that she didn't belong. Not in this place, not in this moment. There was a soft sound, like something tapping on the window. Not the soft rustle of leaves or the whisper of wind. No, this was deliberate, a slow, measured tap. Lisa's heart leapt into her throat. She turned her head slowly, her eyes drawn to the glass. Her breath caught. The deer was back, the same one. It stood there in the fog, unmoving. its eyes locked onto hers, unblinking, unyielding. There was no fear in its gaze, only an unspoken understanding, an invitation. "Turn back," the words whispered, through her mind again, as if the deer itself had spoken them, as if the very world around her was pleading with her to listen. Lisa's hand, shaking uncontrollably, reached for the door handle. She wasn't sure why. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. But she opened the door, stepping out onto the cold, damp gravel. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay. The trees stood like silent sentinels around her, their dark branches bending, twisting, stretching toward her as though they were alive, waiting. The fog seemed to close in tighter with each breath she took, and the temperature had dropped, so drastically that her breath hung in the air like vapor. The deer didn't move. It just stood there, watching her, waiting. Its presence was wrong. Its eyes, those deep pools of shadow, held something beyond animal instinct. Something older, something watchful. As she took a step toward it, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The road, the trees, the fog. It all moved. The world was folding around her, twisting like paper crumpled in a fist. The air pulsed, with a strange energy, a rhythm that made her skin crawl. Her mind reeled. She wanted to scream, to run. But the world was closing in too fast, and then she heard it. A voice. Her voice. Lisa whipped around, her breath catching in her throat. Her reflection stared back at her, not in the car window, not in any mirror, but in the fog itself. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. But there was something wrong with it. The reflection, her reflection, smiled. The smile wasn't her own. It was a twisted, unnatural grin that stretched far too wide. The corners of the mouth tugged back into a grotesque shape. Her eyes, they weren't her eyes anymore. They were dark, hollow pits, like the abyss itself had swallowed them whole. "It's too late for you, Lisa." The voice that came from the reflection wasn't hers. It was hollow, distant, as though it was speaking from the depths of the earth itself. "You were always meant to stay here." Lisa staggered back, her breath quickening as she spun around. But the fog had thickened. The trees had grown taller, more imposing. The road no longer stretched ahead. It had dissolved into nothing. There was only the deer, watching her, and the reflection that stood at the edge of the mist, grinning. Her mind shattered, pieces of her sanity slipping away like grains of sand. She tried to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead, her body unwilling to obey. The fog, the trees, the road, they were all part of the same thing, and she was its prisoner. There was no escape. In that moment, Lisa understood. This road, this highway, wasn't just some forgotten stretch of land. It was a place of entrapment, a place where time had no meaning, where the living and the dead collided. And she was part of it now. She always had been. She had turned off the main road. She had taken that wrong turn. And now, like the others before her, she would be swallowed by it, lost to the fog, a soul caught in an endless cycle of 38. The reflection that had once been her smiled wider. It opened its mouth, but no sound came out. It didn't need to. Lisa stepped forward, her body moving on its own accord, her mind too numb to resist. As she passed the deer, its eyes locked onto hers, its whisper curling into her ears like a promise. It's too late. And then she was gone. The road was still there. The fog still lingered. And the mile markers? So, forever.